Okay, so today we're going to talk about understanding DSLR camera function so that you have a good hold and grasp over the theory surrounding why things work the way they do inside of your camera and why it's an awesome idea to take manual control over your camera. So, I have my camera with me right here. You might have a camera with you, or maybe you're waiting for it to come in the mail, but in either case, I would definitely recommend maybe watching this lecture once without your camera if you don't have it yet, and then once you do have your camera, watch it again so you can work with me on finding some of those settings as I'm pointing them out on the back of your camera and in the display capability for your Nikon or your Canon or whatever kind of camera that you'll be working with this quarter. So I wanted to start the lecture with a couple of images. This one is by Stephen Shore, and it shows this very 1970s looking television screen with a wood paneled wall, taxidermy. It's quite amazing. But one thing you'll note about this image is that everything in the frame of this photograph taken in 1973, everything in this frame is completely sharp and in focus. And this was a conscious choice on the part of the photographer to make sure that when we look at this image, everything is absolutely sharp. In this picture as well, again, we're playing with this idea, Stephen Shore is playing with this idea of the image within the image, or this sort of aspirational, beautiful place that you might go to, some kind of resort in the mountains, but then that being placed in a very desolate area. But another thing to note with this image is that everything is in focus from the billboard that's in the foreground, our subject, all the way to the very back where you see these clouds and mountains. Nothing is blurry and nothing is out of focus in the image. In contrast, this picture by Sarah Ann Austin depicts a little girl in a shopping cart in the middle of a parking lot. And one thing you'll notice is that our subject is completely sharp and in focus, and it really draws your attention and draws your eye into this main, very theatrical, cinematic moment of this little girl pointing in maybe a Walmart parking lot, whereas all of the cars and the haziness sort of falls back into the distance, and it becomes a really quite cinematic photograph. In this image by Sarah Dutton, again, we have a moment where not everything is completely in focus. So we have this very narrow range of focus along where these little teeny bubbles are. Same bubble, different story. And then as we move back into space, things get a little bit blurrier. Now, this focus, out of focus, subject versus background relationship that we're talking about is what we refer to as depth of field. How far back can you see into the distance? And this is really affected by your camera settings. One of those being aperture, which we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means here shortly. But there's three factors that affect depth of field. Those are aperture, focal length, distance from subject. Moving forward, this image by Jennifer Folsom called Quest. We are looking at a picture of a little girl waving a lantern across a lake. And what's wonderful about this image is that we actually have an implied sense of motion because we can actually see her arm as it hazily goes from one side to another. Now, this effect is directly related to the shutter speed of our camera. So depth of field is directly related to aperture. Being able to blur motion as it's happening is directly related to shutter speed, which is another control on your camera. And what's great about this and the ability to understand these settings is that you can really play with what we understand is large, what we understand is small. You can play with perception in some really interesting ways. So this picture by Joseph Hawker is called Two-Legged Beast, and it's really just a couple of little sticks being held up on on sort of a field of pebbles, but because our foreground is out of focus, our background is completely out of focus, we have this very, very narrow field of focus where the sticks are standing up. Our mind can take that title, two-legged beast, and start to apply it to what we're actually looking at, our subject right here, and it becomes this really quite imaginative space. Melinda Hurst Fry's work deals with the reproductive processes seen from the female perspective, and so she creates these still life metaphors with actual flies and then these objects that she constructs that sort of symbolize the egg or symbolize the womb. And I think the softness of these images, this sort of like hyper feminine presentation of these really creamy ivories and color palettes, in combination with how she uses depth of field and focus, makes each of these images, while very, very simple, all of a sudden have a really quite symbolic and metaphorical meaning to them. And then the last photographer who, again, thinking about how scale is affected, Colin Murray, creates these miniature scenes just with a backdrop and household materials. And you notice each of these scenes is a sort of mini disaster where someone's been stranded or lost or sailing through a tumultuous sea. And all through choices in depth of field and scale, presentation, it really starts to become they really start to become these quite cinematic little miniature scenes. So if you have your camera with you, you should totally pick it up. If not, I have a virtual camera for you to look at on the screen. But as we're looking at the back of the camera and all of the buttons on it, it's important to start understanding what each of the buttons controls and what each of these things is in the back display. So the M on the back of your Canon camera here, if you do click the display button, all of that will pop up. And the display button is on the top of your camera. I don't have the same camera as you guys do, but that is how you can pull that up. The M stands for manual mode. We're going to be shooting in manual mode really for the duration of our quarter together. 1/125 on this picture, that fraction number that you're getting on your display is always going to refer to your shutter speed. f2.8, any number that has an F in front of it, refers to your aperture. And then ISO, that third variable of camera settings, refers to your sensor, how sensitive your sensor is. That number should be populated on your back display as well. So those are the main camera settings to look at. This slider scale here underneath is called the EV scale or your light meter. And that's what's going to tell you as you're focusing whether your image is properly exposed, a little bit overexposed, or underexposed. And you can figure that out by looking at the little caret that sort of pops from one side to another based on how bright or how dark your subject is. So that's your light meter, and you can also see that as you look through your viewfinder, which is up here. When you're photographing in our class, you'll always take pictures looking through the viewfinder as opposed to setting it to video mode and looking at the back of your screen. You'll be able to see all of your settings in real time as you're adjusting them while you're looking through the viewfinder, and you'll be able to make faster decisions based on what you see through this window. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Over here, we have your white balance. Right now, if it says AWB, it means it's set to auto white balance. Down here, we have an image that says L, and this is in regards to what shooting mode you're in. I'm going to walk you through how to change the quality of your images, but right now L means that we're shooting in JPEG, and we're going to want to shoot in RAW for the duration of our class. But there's another video walking you through how to adjust all of those settings to where you need them for our class. Over here, you have your battery. Your battery life is really important to pay attention to. You want to charge your battery before any day that you know you're going to be out photographing, and you just want to be prepared. On the back panel here, we have our white balance button. We have a single shooting or timer mode over here. Holding down this button, this little AV button, and then turning the knob up at the top of your T3i or T8i Canon camera will change your aperture setting. And if you're not holding down this button while you're turning the knob on the top of the camera here, you'll be able to change your shutter setting. Your ISO button on the Canon camera is located up here at the top next to your display button. And this wheel on Canon and Nikon cameras is called your mode wheel, where you can switch from manual mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, etc. Do not have your mode on auto. We are always going to be shooting in manual on your on your mode wheel for the duration of the class. I've also included in our lecture an image of the back of your Nikon camera. Very similarly, I believe this is a D3200. Up here, you have your shooting mode. You're going to want to have that as an M or manual mode. Again, that little wheel is located up at the top of your Nikon camera as well. So you want to turn that guy from P or A or S over to the M instead of having it on auto mode. We have your aperture over here. It will always have the F in front of that number. And then your fraction will be your shutter speed, and your ISO is also depicted back here as well. And you'll notice that the ISO jumps by doubling itself. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but no matter what camera you're working with, please be familiar with how to find your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO settings, as well as your light meter or your EV scale as you're looking through the viewfinder of your camera. While you're looking through the viewfinder, if you don't see it right away, if you don't see that pop up, ever so slightly, you can push down on your shutter button here at the top, not all the way because you're not taking a whole picture, but if you just slightly push that down, you'll be able to see the little green LCD screen that pops up that shows you your settings through the viewfinder. Cool. Now, on the front of your camera, we kind of talked about the top and the back of the camera, but the front of your camera is where you'll see your lens that you have attached. If you're working with a kit lens that you have shipped from the school, like an 1855 millimeter lens, you'll see that marked on your lens, and you also have a little lens release button. So when you push that down, you can pull that lens off and on. If you're not switching lenses for the class, or you only are working with one lens, you don't need to worry about taking the lens off at any given point in time. And that's a good thing, because that means you're kind of saving yourself from any kind of sensor dust or anything that you don't really want getting inside of your camera. So you can just leave your lens on, but this button on the side is a release. Canon lenses screw off counterclockwise, just like that. Nikon lenses screw off clockwise. So that's the primary difference there. Cool. And here's the image of the Nikon front of the camera as well, with that lens release button located somewhere around right here. The other thing to note on your lens is that all lenses have an autofocus and a manual focus capability. So if I, here we go. If I have this switched over to manual focus, it means that for every picture that I take, I'm going to have to turn the focus wheel, and you can practice this with me, on the lens in order to find my focus. If I have it switched to AF or autofocus, that means I should be able to focus by ever so slightly pressing down on my shutter button, and you'll see a tiny cluster of red dots that pop up, and then I can take my photo. Now, if you want to experiment with manual focus, If you're photographing with a Nikon camera, what's really great about finding focus is that if you are slightly pressing down on the shutter button, you will see a tiny circle that pops up. Your camera is telling you that that image is indeed in focus, which is really cool if you're not 100% sure or you're not trusting your eyes. Okay, so how do cameras take in an image and create what we see whenever we're viewing our photographs on the back of the camera? Well, the camera is quite a bit like the eye, and this is a scientific demonstration that you've maybe seen before in grade school at one point or another of how our eyes will look at an image, and then that image passes through the lens when it's being illuminated by the light, the lens of our eye. As light passes through the lens, its path gets bent, focusing the waves in towards the retina in your eye. And interestingly, your eyes focus by having the lens change shape depending on the distance to the object, focusing the light onto the retina. So our eyes are constantly changing and adjusting based on if we're in a dark movie theater and we need to see the stairs, or if we're outside by the lake enjoying the beach and we are in very, very different brightness conditions. And then depending on what you're looking at, some things will be more in focus than others, but unlike with a photographic image, when we're looking at something with our eyes, we don't necessarily register all of a sudden that if I'm looking at my camera right here, my camera is in focus, and then everything behind it is out of focus. So our eyes work very similarly to a camera, which also takes in, based on that subject being lit, our lens can move forward and backward to bring objects at different distances into sharp focus. And that's what that focus ring that I was showing you guys is all about. It's adjusting that lens to bring an object into focus, whether you're focusing manually or using our autofocus option. And then the aperture inside of the camera, we'll talk more about that in a second. It'll adjust from larger, letting more light pass from the lens to the light-sensitive surface, whether that's film in your analog camera or our digital sensor that we have in our class. That will change how much actual light we're letting in. And then the shutter opens and closes to limit the duration of time in which the light is striking that light-sensitive surface. And interestingly, just like our eyes, that image is translated actually upside down and then readjusted to be right side up. And what we see through the viewfinder in our digital cameras, unless you're photographing with a mirrorless camera, which we'll also talk about, the viewfinder will show you the picture that you're looking at through the lens, but turned right side up because that picture reflects off of a mirror that's inside of your camera and gets reflected back up into your viewfinder area. So interestingly, cameras are very much like the eye, and they see a little bit differently than the eye as well. So we talked a bit about shifting from autofocus to manual focus, and I want to emphasize this is different than shooting in auto mode versus manual mode, which is the knob up at the top. I would definitely suggest experimenting with manual focus, but as a photographer and in my professional work, typically I utilize the autofocus settings so that I can photograph more quickly and kind of trust the focus of the camera as I'm going from one place to the next. Now, if you have the time to set up a tripod and, take a series of test shots, absolutely experiment with manual focus and go for it. But autofocus tends to be a little bit easier as you're getting started with all of the other manual settings on your camera. As you are focusing on your subject, like this wonderful lounging orange tabby cat right here, it's always a good idea to have some area of focus in your image. The image should not be completely blurry. You should have something that stands out. What I find fascinating about this, GIF that I've included in the lecture is that it shifts from the cat being in focus to the wall, and you can see how the focus really adjusts and determines what we understand as the subject in this picture. Okay, so here's an image where, as I was talking about looking through the viewfinder, what are you actually seeing as you're looking through this area? This is what we're relying on to give us the right perspective, the right framing, the right composition when we're taking our photograph. And when you lightly press that shutter button, you're going to see something that looks something like this, which shows you your battery life, your EV scale or light meter here in the middle, that little caret going from one side to another. And when that little caret is completely lined up in the center, it means that our image is properly exposed. In the case of this image taken outside on someone's beach, the person was shooting at 1/400th of a second. That's our shutter speed. At f2.8, that's our aperture number listed right here, and at ISO 400. It looks like this was also on a Nikon because you see this little round dot. When that appears as you're looking through the viewfinder on a Nikon, it means it is in sharp focus. So let's break down what it means for shutter speed, aperture, and ISO as far as making those manual camera decisions and what that turns out looking like. So in this image, very similar to the girl holding the lantern, we have a moment where everyone is sort of, at a standstill in the middle of this subway station, but we have a moving subway and it's blurred out, and that is caused by that train passing at a faster speed than what your shutter can capture in a single moment. So the slower your shutter speed, the more likely you are to capture motion in an image. If I were taking this photo, or perhaps what Maurizio Massetti was doing when he was taking this photograph, was he went into the subway station, set up a tripod, and then got his exposure correct, but perhaps consciously chose to photograph at 1/60th of a second for his shutter speed. And then that gives the illusion of everyone standing perfectly still. But in that 1/60th of a second time period, we see this much motion of the subway actually rolling through the station, which is an interesting way to kind of control that effect. The more you work with shutter speed, the more you'll become familiar with what it means to photograph at 1/400th of a second as opposed to 1/30th of a second. And all of these, generally speaking, are just fractions of a second. Your shutter goes really, really fast. And as a rule of thumb, you never want to shoot handheld with a shutter speed of less than about 1/100th of a second or 1/125th of a second, because even holding the camera with your hands at that slow of a shutter speed, it might move around a little bit. Whether or not you have shaky hands, it's going to happen. So just be conscious and aware of that. And I would say, as you're getting started, utilize a tripod so you know you have full control and you can actually get the camera out of your hands and put it in a static position where you don't have to worry about it quite as much. And then when we start into portraiture and photographing a bit more handheld, make sure you're not setting your shutter speed lower than 1/100th of a second. So I love the waterfall example here as well, because you can really see how much the shutter speed can affect how that image presents. At an aperture of 2.8 and a shutter of 1/125th of a second, the waterfall is pretty sharp, and we can see all of the little droplets of water as they sprinkle down the side of the rocks here. At 1/10th of a second, we get a bit more of a painterly blur to all of those droplets as they come off the side of the cliff. And then at our slowest shutter speed in this example, which is a ½ second, it is super painterly, very much not what you would see with your eyeball looking at the exact same waterfall. This implies motion and grace and poetry, you know, you could say. I mean, if you've ever gone to a tiny shop over in a like natural park, many local photographers will showcase images like this because they just feel so so soothing and calm because of that slow shutter speed effect. I want to also point your attention to the fact that as the shutter speed changed on each of these waterfall images, the aperture number also was changed intentionally by the photographer. And this is what gives us a consistent exposure across the set. So if you change one variable, you have to change another in order to maintain proper exposure. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like, and it will also play into your law of reciprocity technical exercise coming up. So more about the shutter mechanics. I like this GIF because it shows a super slowed down, 100 times slowed down version of what happens when that shutter curtain pops down, as you can see, and that curtain comes down again, the whole thing sort of collapses on itself. That is the mechanical process of that shutter opening and closing within a very short period of time. Again, we're talking 1/400th of a second that all of these mechanics happen. It's pretty incredible. In a mirrorless camera, you don't have the whole mechanics of this because everything is controlled digitally, and it's all sensor based. So the difference between a single lens reflex camera or DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera, and a mirrorless camera is that a mirrorless camera does not have the fully functioning mechanics of a shutter. What's fascinating about digital cameras as they've been around since the 1990s and in comparison with analog cameras is that the mechanics of both of these units as far as the shutter and the aperture are exactly identical. The only difference between a film camera and a digital SLR camera is that for a film camera you use film as that exposure surface, whereas with the digital camera the sensor inside of the camera is the thing that actually collects that data file that you can process digitally. And here I've included a diagram that kind of explains the difference. Mirrorless cameras don't have that moment of light coming in, going through the sensor, through the shutter, and that mirror hitting that pentaprism up at the top, which reflects the image into the viewfinder. Instead, when you look at the mirrorless camera, everything that you see is entirely digital based off the LED screen on the back display of that camera and up at the top. So that's the thing that you lose in a mirrorless camera. But it has a lot of other really cool opportunities and possibilities. For this class, we're going to be primarily talking about the DSLR functions and functionality, but I think it's important to mention the difference between each kind of camera because they do both produce digital photographs. So moving on from shutter speed to aperture. In the past, many lenses would have all of their possible aperture numbers actually printed on the side of that lens. And the aperture is a very lens-specific function. It's actually not a camera-specific function. It is your lens's function that tells you how far open that lens gets, which controls how much light is coming in. When we talk about apertures, we describe them in terms of a term called stops or full stops. And all of our apertures start at f 1.4 in a lens that has a really, really open, it can be a really, really open lens, and then as closed down as f/22, which is super teeny tiny. And you can see in the diagram that I've included here, the aperture mechanics work as these little blades which sort of slowly close in on themselves depending on what your actual aperture setting is. And our stops work in terms of halving or doubling the amount of light that we're letting in. For example, at a very open aperture for this lens at f2.8, it's going to give us twice as much light as f4. And at f5.6, we're going to get half as much light as f4, but twice as much light as f8. This is going to sound like a lot of weird math right now, which is totally fine. Once you put this into practice in the law of reciprocity exercise, it's going to make hopefully a little bit more sense. One thing you can do, because all of these do have reciprocal relationships, is you can always write down a chart of full stops because these numbers never change. And the good news is there's a pattern. So if I start at f1.4, 1.4 times 2 is 2.8. 2.8 times 2 is 5.6. 5.6 times 2 is 11. We like to round in photography. It's not exactly that, but close enough. And then 11 times 2 is 22. And then our alternating numbers, f2 closes down to f4, to f8, f16, they double. So if you can memorize 1.4 and 2, you can actually draw out or map out this entire chart on your own. The importance of aperture, as we talked about in some of those intro images that I discussed as far as depth of field, is that we really have the opportunity to isolate subject from background and really experiment with depth of field, what's in focus and what's a little bit blurry. In this portrait of Zofia from the 1920s, I think this is a phenomenal example because her eyes are super crisp and super sharp and are super captivating. They just pull you in, and she's wearing this lovely fur garment around her shoulders, and all of that translates as fur, but it's softened by the fact that the depth of field just falls off a little bit in the front and really falls off in the back to where we have this really wonderful area of blur as we get really any area from her eyes towards the back of her head. In this more contemporary portrait of George Clooney, a really similar thing happens. His eyes are in super crisp focus, but even as we get to the sides of his face, where his beard is, it starts to soften. And then by the time we get back in the distance all the way to his ear, everything is definitely blurry and out of focus, making his eyes the most compelling part of this portrait. And it makes sense because many people would argue that it's the George Clooney eyes or the George Clooney look that he's known for. So, another example of how the aperture looks as it closes down. The more open that aperture is, or the smaller number, starting at like 1.4, we're letting a lot more light into camera. We'll have to adjust by having a faster shutter speed. And we're going to produce a blurrier background. Whereas as we start to close down to a more closed down stop, like f22, we're letting in less light into the camera, we have a slower shutter speed, and we're getting a lot more in the frame in focus. Here's a GIF where you can see the aperture actually in motion, how it changes. And what's great about this image is that each time the aperture changes, you can actually see how the background becomes more in focus as it gets smaller, and then more out of focus as the aperture becomes wider. Another example of how this looks, starting at f1.8, a really open aperture. The subject right here is going to be in focus in the background. We really can't tell what's behind this little flower. And then as we start closing down, I can finally tell that there's a path. There's 3 trees and a light post in the background, and all of that sort of becomes washed out with the focus on the subject in the f1.8 image. And this particular illustration is going to be very similar to your law of reciprocity exercise. So to conclude on aperture, aperture is really a quite responsible factor in determining depth of field. And depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the furthest objects that give an image judged to be in focus in camera. Or in other words, how much detail can you see in the distance behind the subject? Aperture is one of 3 variables that affect depth of field. The others are your distance from the subject as you're taking the picture, and the third is the focal length of your lens, what focal length you're shooting at. On your kit lenses, you have a range between 18 millimeters and 55 millimeters because you have a zoom lens on that camera. Some lenses have a fixed focal length, so you might have a 50 millimeter lens that you're shooting with for the class. You might have an 85 millimeter lens that doesn't have a zoom function to it. In this image of the this Christmas deer here, you can kind of see how the focal length in this first set of images is at 70 millimeters, so we're a little bit more zoomed out from the subject. And because we're more zoomed out, there's a little bit less of a dramatic effect, but you can still see it happening as this becomes slowly more and more into focus in the background. Whereas in this image example at the bottom, now we're photographing at a focal length of 105 millimeters, and the effects are definitely more dramatic as far as what's in focus and how the background becomes very much blurrier as opposed to when we're photographing at f22. You might be asking, okay, well, it's great that there's these numbers that I can memorize, and that's cool, but what does that actually mean, and how do we get those weird numbers with the aperture? Well, it's actually derived from an equation that we can summarize as n equals f over d, where n is that weird decimal number or that f number that your camera is giving you, equals f, which is the focal length of the lens that you're using, and d is the diameter of the entrance pupil, and that refers to the actual diameter from one side of the lens to another. And again, all lenses are a little bit different, so those numbers are going to be different, but they're always going to turn into those full stops that we talked about in the last couple of slides, starting at widest aperture of f1.4 and then going to f22. Depending on what your lens is, like if you do have a kit camera and you have that 18 to 55, your most wide open aperture might be f4 or f5.6, and that's totally fine. The reason why people spend a lot of money on lenses and why a lot of avid photographers have a lot of different lenses is because they want lenses that can do the f1.4, f2.8 as well. And we talked about this a little bit. You can write out and calculate aperture numbers in a chart of full stops once you understand how that pattern looks. Broken down mechanically, your focal length that we talked about, that f number in our equation, the focal length of a lens is measured from the midpoint of that lens, and the lens is this convex shape on both sides, so it measures from the middle of that lens all the way to the back of your camera sensor. And as that lens moves, like from 18 to 55, the focal length changes what that distance is. Focal lengths vary by lens, so you'll notice in this example of a series of Canon lenses, this one has a focal length of 55 to 250. This one has a focal length of 70 to 300, and this one has a focal length of 70 to 200. So it will always vary based on what kind of lens you're working with. The focal length, that millimeters number that your camera is giving you, or that zoom, if you want to talk about like an 18 to 55 or a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, that range determines how close you can get to your subject from a distance. For example, if I'm trying to photograph this little bunch of birds, if I'm photographing at 70 millimeters, I'm going to get mostly lake in my shot, but just like a pair of binoculars, the higher the number of millimeters is, the longer that focal length, the closer into the subject I can get when I'm standing far away. Generally speaking, your lens, any lens, has a sweet spot located right in the middle of all of its possible aperture numbers. So if my lens has a widest aperture of 1.4 and a most closed down aperture of f/22, my sweet spot is going to be probably around f5.6, that middle spot. What I would encourage you to do once you have your camera, or maybe you have your camera with you, is figure out what your widest aperture is on your particular lens and what your most closed down aperture is on your particular lens. Of course, you can use your apertures as you like for whatever kind of creative purposes, as we talked about, and knowing what each of those numbers will do differently is really important in terms of making your own photographic decisions. Lastly is ISO. That's the third major camera variable that you have to keep in mind as you're shooting with your digital camera. ISO refers to the sensitivity of your camera's sensor, and this is sensitivity to light information coming through. I like this photo because it shows sort of how much that ISO can be pushed. It gives you this awful signal noise, and I like the example of the phone because if you think about a phone camera, that sensor is just about the size of your fingernail on your pinky finger. It's not very big, whereas in your camera, it's about yay big, about an inch by an inch and a half. And each of these sensors or exposure surfaces is going to yield significantly different results. And you've probably noticed if you've tried photographing with your camera phone in a low light situation that you get a lot of signal noise or these little dots that get in the way of seeing that image. You get that artifacting effect. Here's an actual picture of rendering of what that sensor looks like in your camera. And the sensor size is really what affects, that pricing structure for your camera body. If you're in the market for a camera body, or maybe you're interested in getting one after this class, the more expensive the camera is, it's probably because that sensor is bigger and bigger. And the sensor is what allows you to do all of those like large format printing options. It allows you a lot more high dynamic range as you're editing, and generally speaking is the most valuable aspect of your digital camera. It affects how many megapixels it outputs. So if we look at the iPhone 11, or the iPhone 11 Pro, which came out somewhat recently, this camera phone has a 12 megapixel sensor, whereas these kit cameras, the T3i, has only an 18 megapixel sensor, which is actually only 6 more megapixels than the iPhone 11 Pro. The T3i, however, is going to produce dramatically higher quality results because that sensor is larger and because it's working with a lot of glass in that lens. You have significantly more glass in your DSLR camera than you do even if you buy a kit of lenses for your iPhone. It's just a very, very different output device. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of you will get shipped the Canon T3i's. Some of you will be working with the Canon T8i's, which have, I believe, a 22 or 24 megapixel sensor. So tiny bit of difference. So if you're photographing at night, for example, and you don't have a tripod, you'll notice that you can't get your shutter lower, you can't get your aperture any wider, and so you have to resort to turning up your ISO if you're not with a tripod. So in this example, photographing the top of this building, if I'm shooting on a tripod and I can photograph it properly exposed with an ISO of 100, I'm going to get a lot better results than shooting it at ISO 3200, where all of a sudden I have all of this grainy signal noise that's not really ideal. So for photographing architecture, for photographing those awesome night scenes of cars running by with trailing lights, it's always a good idea to have a tripod so that you can avoid photographing handheld and having to pump that ISO up significantly. Another note with sensors, the bigger your sensor is, the better the performance your camera will have at higher ISO settings. So something to keep in mind if you are thinking about upgrading your camera in the future. And the thing to look for, if you're taking notes, is a full frame camera, full frame sensor, which means you're going to be totally fine photographing it an ISO of 1250 or 1600 without getting quite as much of this signal noise. And if you're wondering, well, where does that signal noise come from? How does that work? Why is this happening? Well, you can kind of think about it like audio distortion. If you're at a really loud club or you're at a concert and you're standing near the band and maybe standing near the subwoofers or near the speakers, and you notice you're not getting a lot of that clarity from the sound that you're hearing, it's all becoming distortion because it's turned up really, really loud and you're standing really, really close to it, and it's not sounding really anything like the recording that you've heard before going to that concert. And don't get me wrong, it's an amazing experience, but the louder you turn up that sensor, the higher those numbers get, the more of that distortion is going to happen. Speaking of band photography, of course, if you are photographing a show or a concert for an artist, and obviously you're not going to walk around the arena or walk around the venue with a clunky tripod, a lot of times you are going to have to make the sacrifice of photographing with a higher ISO to get a nice sharp musician image as they're right up on the mic. But it's not ideal for everything, like architecture, like I talked about. So there's certain scenarios where photographing with a high ISO is absolutely what you want to do, and that's okay, and certain scenarios where you definitely don't. Something to note is that each increment, every time you adjust ISO, it doubles the sensitivity of the sensor. So going from, in this image, ISO 100 to 200, 400, 800, 1600, the image is getting brighter and brighter. And just like with anything else, you'll have to adjust in that reciprocal relationship, either your shutter speed or your aperture, in order to maintain proper exposure. So those are the three main things. Now, there are a couple of other automatic exposure options on your mode wheel in the top of your camera there. It's AV on a Canon camera, it's A on a Nikon camera, and essentially what that shooting mode determines is, it says you pick the aperture, what aperture you want to shoot at, and the camera will do the rest. It will adjust your shutter speed, your ISO to meet that aperture. Alternatively, the TV setting on a Canon camera or the S setting on a Nikon camera will allow you to pick a shutter speed that you'd like to shoot with, and then your camera will adjust to get proper exposure. Now, this works, in my experience, about 75% of the time, because it depends on if you have spot metering on and what areas are bright versus what areas are dark, how bright your sky is. So it's not really something to rely on, but it can be really useful in a pinch. Oh, and here's another example of that. So as we're talking about exposure and the histogram in the back of your camera, if you hit the info button on any given image that you've taken, you're going to see this little graph on the back, which is actually mapping out all of the pixels that you've taken in an image. And you can find this in your display settings on your Canon camera, and you can also find it in your Nikon. I don't think I included an image of how to do that, but I will find that and send it to you if you're struggling to figure out where that is. The histogram is essentially a visual map of where your pixels are. Now, in this example, we have a spike up here at the right side. A spike on one side or the other, where those pixels are clustering, might mean that your image is way overexposed or way underexposed. And that's something to be really aware of. The histogram is also the unit that you'll be able to adjust when you are editing your images in Lightroom. You can pull those highlights in, you can pull those shadows up as we start working on our image edits. So that histogram is going to go with you from the back of your camera per image all the way to your Lightroom window when we start editing the images from your shoot. And that map essentially maps the number of pixels of any given tone, whether that's RGB, which are the primary colors of light, the reds, greens, blues, or in a black and white image, the total range from pure black pixels to pure white pixels from one side to the other of the histogram. And here's a good example showing what it looks like, what a histogram might look like if you have an underexposed image, a well-exposed image, and then an overexposed image. You can kind of see how those pixels march from one side of the graph to another, or to the other. Another thing to talk about briefly, we're going to go into detail with this in the next couple of weeks, but white balance, which is notated as the WB button on the back of your camera, is essentially your camera's ability to adjust for color settings depending on what kind of light you're photographing in. So your camera will show you a series of icons that are anything ranging from auto white balance, where you say, all right, camera, you decide, to shooting in daylight, shooting on a cloudy day, shooting on a shady day, or in the shade, shooting in tungsten light, which would be like photographing in a living room with the lamps on, fluorescent light, like the lights that are very quite institutional, if you're in a DePaul classroom, for example, flash from your camera, or custom, which means actually setting the light temperature numbers yourself. And over here, we measure our light temperature in Kelvin. And on this map, from 1000 Kelvin to 10,000 Kelvin, you can see how the color of light changes based on what kind of light is used in your image or to light your subject. So the very warmest type of light at 1000 is like a candlelight scenario, whereas a clear skylight, open shade, no direct sun, the kind of light you get if you're up in Antarctica where it's super, super blue, that's your 10,000 Kelvin. And then anything in between ranges from your 75 watt light bulb to a 500 watt photo flood bulb, an industrial smog kind of light, a noon direct sun electronic flash, which is sitting right around 5600, and to your daylight or overcast day, your daylight or foggy day. It all has a totally different color of light as far as how your camera reads it. So I would encourage you, if you have your camera with you, or when your camera gets here, to find where your white balance setting is. I've included an image where it is on Canon with all of those icons. You're going to hit that WB button, and if you have a Nikon, you'll go into the menu, find white balance, and all of those settings pop up, so you can adjust it by scrolling down that menu. few last things before we wrap up our basic functions lecture. First is photographing in RAW. In our class, we will only be photographing in RAW, which gives you the highest possible file size for your high dynamic range, editing, and exporting your images. A RAW file it's like the Great Wall of China. It's huge. You can do a lot with it. You can take it down, keep it together, whatever. Whereas a JPEG file is like a little piece of drywall hanging out. There's not as much you can do to alter it, manipulate it, anything like that. JPEGs are a compressed file output type, which you create once you're done editing your raw image, whereas RAW files are not compressed. And you can see in this image that I've included of this portrait, this is our raw image before any editing has happened, and this is our after image. And you can just tell from how much brighter, how much more contrast we have in this image, how the color balance has been modified significantly for a nice warm look for the portrait. There's so much more opportunity editing-wise with raw images as opposed to JPEGs. And I like to talk about it in terms of making that photograph really sing. Another housekeeping thing to talk about today is your data storage in your camera. So you should all find where that SD card, or maybe for some of you, you use a CF card, which looks like this. There is a spot or a slot in your camera where that card goes in. And it's really important that we are formatting our card in our camera before every single shoot, because that will prevent you from losing data, prevent your card from becoming corrupt, and all of that. What I never want you guys to do is what I never want you guys to do is delete images one by one using that little trash can button on the back of your camera, because that creates a problematic situation, especially as you get close to filling up your card. So please do not use the trash can button ever, ever, ever. Very, very importantly. And I'll tell you why. Your card collects files very similar to like a very, very full parking lot like the one in the picture right here. And the more full your card gets, the more you might be like, maybe I'll just delete this underexposed picture and use that trash can button. And maybe you make a little slot for it. Well, the reason why that becomes problematic, as Jim Carrey is describing for us in that GIF, is that if I do have a bigger file that comes in, because not all files are the same size, something like this might happen. Oops. Where we have that big file coming in, and it's just gonna plow through anything it needs to in order to find that potentially open space. And something like that's gonna happen. And that is how your card becomes corrupt, which is not ideal. So, before every shoot, you need to format that memory card. After every shoot, you're going to dump all of your images onto your external hard drive. So in the next video, we'll show you how to format your card between each shoot. But this is really important to make sure that you have the maximum amount of opportunity and space on that card, and you minimize the risk of losing your data or losing any important information. So, as you go out and you start experimenting with your camera, keep thinking about composition, think about your vantage point, and really how and what will you photograph? Where do you start? Where are you standing in relation to the subject? What angle are you photographing at? What kind of background and foreground information is there in that image? What does the lighting look like? All of that. And we'll be experimenting with a lot of these different techniques and strategies specifically in the upcoming videos for the class. But my hope is that the more comfortable you become with your camera, the more comfortable you become with your manual settings, the more confidence you will have and the less prone you'll be to doing something like chimping, which is when you take one picture and then you look at it, and then you take another picture and then you look at it. It's a very touristy way to use a camera. You will find you're ready to start photographing, and this will, it'll just get easier and easier as you go. So that is the introduction to our camera settings and camera functions. Again, I highly recommend you work back through just the slides and not the whole lecture once you do have your camera, if you don't have one already. And I look forward to seeing the pictures that you start to make with it as you get more comfortable with your settings.